Welcome back, everyone. Michael here with Offshore Citizen. I had some friends visiting from Canada yesterday, and while showing them around a little bit and having them delight at Dubai and mentioning how there's no taxes in Dubai, they asked a question which I think is fairly common, and this is, how does this country operate with no taxes? So today I'm going to discuss how it works for countries that don't have taxes, how they're able to operate and provide, actually in some cases, really good services, really good infrastructure, in some cases less so. And you can kind of be the judge, because I think it's important today. We have this narrative which is out there, and that is, hey, people should pay their taxes. If they don't pay their taxes, people won't have services, etc. And so, you need to contribute your fair share. And yet, you can go to different parts of the world and you can see, well, the ROI is really bad in some country like Canada or UK or Australia, etc., because actually the services and quality of life, etc., are really good in these other places, but without that tax. And if you want to kind of exasperate that, just consider that, again, looking at a country like Canada, what have you got? You've got enormous debt plus enormous taxes, which means that the taxes aren't even covering what it is that their government is spending, and so really it should probably be close to double the cost to the government for what it is that they are delivering you, which is pretty appalling. So today we're going to uncover the mystery of what that is. Before we do, if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button, hit the all notification bell. Really appreciate your support working on growing the channel. And if you like the video, give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends. If you want help with relocating abroad, determining where to live, getting a residency, citizenship, etc., please reach out to me. You can book a call, calendly.com/Michael-Rosmer. There's a link in the description below, or send a message to our websites, offshorecitizen.net and offshorecapitalist.com. So let's start with breaking this down into two separate pieces. The first piece is, how does the country generate revenue? Because these countries are not zero revenue, right? They do get revenue from some places. They have simply chosen different places to get the revenue from than a lot of the conventional quote-unquote developed countries that are high tax have chosen to get that. And if you think about it, the idea of paying taxes based on your income is an inherently bad deal for anyone who makes a lot of income, right? Because what it costs you to live might be, I don't know, let's just say that the provision of services costs 20 grand a year, but your tax bill could be millions a year potentially, right? Not a very good equation. Now, if everybody is kind of at the same sort of middle level, then maybe it balances out, maybe it doesn't. You'd have to see country by country and based on the services. You also have to consider, I think, if you're being fair, the short versus the long term. So for instance, you might not care that much about the provision of free medical services when you're 20 years old, but when you're 73, you might care a lot. And it just happens that the vast majority of medical spending comes in the later years of your life. So in other words, all of your entire lifetime of medical spending up to about the last 5 years of your life is small compared to the total that you pay at the end. So it is worth understanding that and bearing it in mind as you decide where to live and as you think about the costs here. But that's going to be the first thing we'll talk about, is how do they generate revenue? The second is, how do they manage costs? Because these are both, if we don't look at both sides of the equation, then it is inherently inaccurate. Okay, we just don't understand what's going on. So let's start on the revenue side. First of all, if we look at a country like UAE, for example, I'm going to use them as an example, but we'll talk a bit about Hong Kong and Singapore, which aren't actually zero tax, but we can learn something from their system. There are things like, for instance, taxation on oil companies and foreign banks. Okay, so these two actually do pay tax inside UAE, and that generates some income. Now, it's actually not as big as some might believe. For example, Dubai, only something like 2.5% of GDP is derived from oil. So some people seem to say, oh, they can do this because they have all this money from oil. Actually, Dubai does not, at least not at this stage. So they have to generate revenue in other ways. Now, the next really common one is things like tourism tax. So people who are going to hotels, possibly cruise ships, there might be fees regarding those sorts of things, etc. So there's various different tourist taxes that get applied. And these are kind of fair because for the people who use them more, it costs more. It's just kind of built into your cost of travel, of doing business, and they can adjust accordingly. The market can respond to, are those taxes too high or too low? You'll see the flow of people. But especially when you've built a place that is really unique and offers a lot, or maybe you are blessed with the natural geography. For example, if you're Bahamas or Cayman Islands or British Virgin Islands or Anguilla, something like that, you have these great benefits of really good natural beauty, and if people want to come and see it, they can pay for it accordingly. And the reality is they've already decided that they're paying for it. It's just a question of how much is going to the government. You could see similar sort of kind of consumption taxes where maybe, for example, airlines might pay a fee. Sometimes there's a built-in fee per passenger, etc., that gets applied, and that allows them to provide, like airports, right? Turns out, again, in Dubai, I don't know, the Dubai airport is maybe the second best that I've seen in the world. It's pretty good. Not as good as Singapore. Singapore is just ridiculously amazing, but it's definitely up there in terms of one of the top airports. And, you get that without having to pay any personal tax or business tax, at least income tax. Then you sometimes have real estate. This is really, really common in a country like Singapore or Hong Kong. There, the government pretty much owns all the real estate, and they do long-term leases. So you get this leasehold concept, and these need to be renewed periodically, and this generates a form of revenue for the government. I think this actually works pretty well. There have been some studies done, I think it was by the OECD, looking at the impact of different types of taxes on whether people would relocate and move out. They found corporate taxes are the worst. Raising corporate taxes generally are a bad idea because companies are really mobile. They can move away. Then you add personal taxes. Again, generally people can move fairly easily. For example, maybe they move from California to Arizona or California to Texas, etc. Then you had consumption taxes, and this is like VAT, GST, etc. Could also maybe include, taxes on vices, cigarettes, gambling, etc. And then the last one that had the least effect on where people would live, etc., were property taxes. And you'll see this with, for example, Texas, right? You can compare Texas to California. Texas has no state income tax, but they do have quite a bit higher real estate tax. So it balances out, and it turns out that seems to work pretty well. So that model is sensible because some places are just more desirable to live. And someone says, okay, they can build it in. Interestingly, although wealth taxes function similar to real estate taxes, they just don't seem to be treated the same way. Wealth taxes generally are pretty bad. They haven't worked very well in really anywhere that they've been applied. I guess maybe someone might argue Switzerland, but generally speaking, it tends to work against them. And yet, real estate tax, which is really a wealth tax on real estate, seems to function all right. Sometimes what you'll have is stamp duties. And so these are not ongoing real estate taxes, but they'll be transfer taxes. So when you transfer, for example, in Dubai, there's a fee each time the property gets transferred that gets paid. And sometimes they do both. So, some places they'll have wealth taxes, real estate taxes, and stamp duties, but that's not common in high tax or in like zero tax haven type countries. And then, of course, there's 5% VAT in UAE. There's 15% now in Saudi Arabia. And so again, there seems to be this general move towards more consumption-based taxes, which I think a lot of people have the idea are a little bit more fair, because people who are going to spend their money on consumption, if you're going to go buy a new Lamborghini and you pay some tax on it, all right. Now, this doesn't seem to work that great on everything, because some goods you can buy abroad, right? So for example, it would be pretty common that my wife and I, not really specifically to do with tax, but just due to shopping for, say, clothing, we're going to plan on, all right, we're going to be going to Italy, so we'll do a bunch of shopping when we're there, and we won't do it in some other country where the prices are higher. So you can kind of see how people can make decisions on certain types of items pretty easily and other items not so well. One of the great examples of this is the effectiveness of Singapore's what they call certificate of entitlement. So it's extremely expensive to own a car in Singapore. And the reason is the certificate of entitlement drives the price of the vehicle to around 4x what it would be in, say, the United States. So that, Toyota Prius is probably $120,000 or something. If you see a Lamborghini in Singapore, you're talking about, it probably costs around $2 million, depending on the vehicle. And that's because of this certificate of entitlement that you need to get, which lasts for 10 years. There's a bunch of criteria around it. But actually, the Singapore government generates quite a lot of revenue from it. It does a couple things. One is it reduces traffic. So traffic is quite good for the most part in Singapore. whereas you could really easily get very congested, which you see in a lot of major cities, and it of course decreases air pollution. So the thing that works about that is, they also have really good public transit. So by contrast, if I was to look into rural Canada, it doesn't really make sense to do a system like that because people really need to get around. And I've seen some criticisms similarly in Sweden, where people in rural Sweden are critical of people in Stockholm who want to get rid of vehicles, and they're saying, look, in Stockholm you can do that. Out here you have to drive 30 to 50 kilometers to get to work. It's just not viable. So countries have to sort of play around with what works for them. But in Singapore, it turns out this has worked really great to have this certificate of entitlement. There's some other things that they can do. For example, if you look at a bunch of the Caribbean countries, I think when I was interviewing the head of the CBI program for Antigua and Barbuda, they mentioned that the CBI program is responsible for something like 10% of GDP, which is massive. That's a lot of their revenue. I think in Dominica, the figures are it's about 20% of government revenue comes from their CBI program. And so certainly certain countries have the ability to do things like selling their citizenship, having residency programs, etc., that can generate extra income. So there are definitely a bunch of different ways in which these countries do generate revenue. The last one, which maybe kind of gets overlooked, is if you're someplace in like UAE, the royal family are owners in a bunch of the major industries. For example, Etisalat, the cell phone provider, Emaar, the largest, most successful development company, etc. So they get to benefit from the halo of all the good that comes into Dubai, right? So you have some of these elements that are pretty useful. So that's that. The second side of it is the cost side. So if you think about what's provided in some place like, let's use Canada as an example, a pretty large share of revenue gets spent on Social Security and healthcare. Okay, these two things consume quite a lot. And if you're in a country like Dubai, although actually for locals they're treated very well, meaning people who have the citizenship, right? So local Emiratis, they get treated quite well by the government. Lots of free stuff, things are great. The actual population is maybe 10% locals, 90% expats. And the consequence of this is expats don't get all those things, right? They basically say, hey, you're welcome to come, so long as you're here to contribute in some way, and we're not going to pay for all these extra things for you. So what are we going to provide? We're going to provide rule of law, law enforcement, defense, security, right? Infrastructure such as roads, etc. Administration, that's kind of it, right? All these other things that you're used to providing, yeah, we're not going to provide that stuff. And so don't come here and think that you're going to get a free lunch. Countries sort of have to decide, but you have to realize just what a huge share of the country's revenue goes to pay for all this other stuff, right? Canada was giving out $2,000 a month over a large portion, if not all of I guess it wouldn't have been all, but a large portion of 2020 to a large number of people in their CERP program. What does that cost the country? I mean, it costs billions and billions of dollars, right? Tons and tons of money that goes out. And the reality is that's money's being paid by someone, right? Ultimately, it has to come from somebody's tax dollars over time, right? Or else you erode savers through some sort of inflation, one of the two. So if you're going to give all those things, there's a cost. And increasingly, the challenge, of course, as people on this channel know, is people who don't want to pay can leave. They can go to some place like UAE where they say, yeah, I pay for all these extras that I want. What's my health insurance? Well, I'm going to pay for my own health insurance. It's going to cost me anywhere from, on the very bare minimum, $1,300 a year, maybe something like that. Or actually, I think you can actually get it for 1,300 dirhams a year as the most basic of the basic coverages. But maybe it costs you a few $100s a month, and you say, okay, I've got pretty great coverage. You're going to have to pay for schooling. Okay, whatever that's going to cost for your kids, etc. Usually, you've got companies that pick up this burden, right? They say, okay, we're going to pay for education of your kids. We're going to pay for healthcare, etc. And that's the way it's going to go. And when you run down, you think, okay, well, what is it really that I like here? Okay, Social Security. Well, I'd rather kind of save myself, So, don't really care that you provide that. Healthcare, all right, let's find out what the real cost is based on insurance company providers in a free market, right? Which unfortunately a lot of the markets aren't free. And by saying a lot of them aren't free, I'm referring to places like the US, right? Where there's supposed to be a free market. It's absolutely not a free market in the US. Canada, the healthcare is not, there's no free market there, etc. But in theory, you can have a free market system that works pretty well. Education, again, typically not free market, but you can put it in the context of a free market and see what it's actually worth, which should be a lot less than what people are paying. So yeah, you have these two sides, right? The one is, hey, we generate some revenue in one way or another, but we don't need to generate as much revenue because we're not providing as much to people. And the people, frankly, are okay with it. And I think increasingly what you're going to find is there's going to be more places who will get creative about the ways that they generate revenue. They will generate revenue more based on provision of services that you pay for. That are attractive in that place, whether that is basically renting you property through leaseholds or some sort of property taxes, or whether it is something like VAT, however they decide to generate it. And then the flip side is that some of these things that they've kind of been bloated and frankly probably come about largely through lobbying, right? Where you have a group of people who say, hey, we want the government to provide this, and it gets imposed on the people who don't want the government to provide it. That's going to deteriorate because the people who are most able to provide it will be able to go somewhere else. So anyway, we'd love to hear your thoughts on the subject. Put them in the comments below, let me know. And if you like the video, give it a thumbs up. Like I said, share it with your friends. I'm going to look forward to seeing you on the next video.